Ladies and gentlemen, could we ask you to kindly take your seats? A very warm welcome to you, those of you who have joined us in room 11 here at UNESCO headquarters, and also those who are connected online. My name is Krista Pikat, and I'm the Culture and Emergencies Entities Head, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this workshop that actually aims to build awareness among the international community about the dangers and risks related to the protection of cultural heritage in Afghanistan. It's part of the UNESCO's action plan to fight against the illicit trafficking of cultural property in Afghanistan that was presented to our executive board at its 217th session. We all know that the protection of Afghan movable cultural heritage is a pressing issue that requires strong international cooperation and coordinated efforts. And of course, all the stakeholders to be engaged, starting from member states to experts, to culture professionals, law enforcement agents, also the art market dealers have a very, very important role to play, as well as museums. And this is why today's workshop actually has two sessions. The first one will present expert views on the situation of illicit trafficking of cultural objects most at risk. And the second panel will discuss challenges and tools. We are privileged to have top experts in this area with us today. And before I give the floor to our Assistant Director General for Culture, Mr. Ernesto Ottone, I just want to signal that we have interpretation available in English and French. So please do not hesitate to find the appropriate channel in whatever language you prefer. So Ernesto, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. So, distinguished delegates, the representative of art market, museum professionals, respected experts, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great honor that we welcome you all to this awareness-raising workshop for the international art market and museum on the fight against illicit trafficking of Afghan culture property. First and foremost, I would like to thank all participants, representatives from member states, I see some ambassadors here, academics, partner institutions, and representatives of the art market, including museum professionals, for their participation in this important meeting, as well as all representatives from member states and participants that follow us online. Let me extend my particular gratitude to our Afghan expert for joining this discussion, also to the ambassador here present. As you know, Afghanistan has a rich and diverse cultural heritage and is home to numerous archaeological sites, museums, and libraries. However, decades of conflict and instability, disaster, mining, and construction projects have contributed to putting this heritage at high risk of neglect, destruction, and systematic looting and illicit trafficking. Against this backdrop, UNESCO, as you know, the United Nations agency with a specific mandate to protect cultural heritage, has taken significant strides in combating the illicit trafficking of cultural property in Afghanistan. Working in the spirit of the 1917 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, which Afghanistan ratified in 2005. Within the UN Strategic Framework for Afghanistan, UNESCO, through its office in Kabul, continues to work on the ground to protect cultural heritage, including the two World Heritage Sites of Bamiyan and Jam Minaret. Since August 2021, UNESCO has supported emergency assessment, inventory, and relocation of cultural objects, as well as documentation, monitoring, and preservation of cultural sites in several provinces. UNESCO has also reinforced the capacity of law enforcement and the judiciary in Central Asia countries to protect Afghan cultural property through a workshop conducted last year with the support of the Heritage Emergency Fund. Additionally, it has created a regional network to facilitate the exchange of information and joint action, which will be further strengthened in another workshop scheduled for October of this year. These concrete actions have already yielded tangible results, such as the seizure of cultural objects by customs officials in Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan. Ladies and gentlemen, conscious of the urgent need to safeguard movable cultural heritage in Afghanistan, the 270th session of the UNESCO Executive Board, held in October last year, adopted an action plan to fight against the illicit trafficking of Afghan cultural property, based on 4 pillars, namely advocacy and awareness raising, technical assistance and capacity building, monitoring and assessment, and finally, engagement with local communities. Today's workshop is organized in the framework of the implementation of the action plan. The protection of Afghan cultural heritage necessitates strengthened information sharing and collaboration among states, mainly those bordering Afghanistan, and among all concerned stakeholders, including experts and market professionals and museum staff. In that sense, I would like to inform you that we are working to advocate that the text of the Pact for the Future that is discussed at the UN level in New York strengthens the protection of cultural heritage and condemns action that undermine culture in the context of conflict and crisis situations. I would like to thank the Member States who can join to ensure this inclusion and support from their delegation in New York so that the texts relating to culture are retained in the final draft. The commitment of art market to abide by better acquisitions policy and strict ethical rules is critical to protect Afghan cultural property. As some of you may be aware, UNESCO is currently consulting the art market on the revision of its International Code of Ethics for dealers in cultural property. And I wish to welcome the dialogue initiated over the last 2 years with the art market on this important work. In this regard, I would like to take this opportunity to inform you that UNESCO will organize on June 14 a workshop bringing together representatives of art market and member states to gradually find a common ground on the principles that should govern the art market so as to ensure its active engagement in our common fight against illicit trafficking. Today's event aims to provide an overview of the situation of illicit trafficking in Afghanistan and raise awareness about the categories of cultural objects most at risk, discuss the challenges of the art market and museums professionals in the exercise of due diligence, and showcase examples of good practices as well as prospects for the future to combat the illicit trafficking of Afghan cultural property. In this regard, ICOM's effort to update the red list of Afghanistan antiquities at risk, the last version of which dates back to 2008, are much more welcome. The red list are indeed essential tools for law enforcement and the art market to identify those cultural objects that are more likely to be trafficked. UNESCO is pleased to support ICOM's revision of the Afghanistan's red list that should be completed by the end of this year. I would also wish to acknowledge the contribution of the donors of the 70 Convention Fund who have made this activity possible today. Thank you for your participation and for your commitment to ensuring the preservation of the cultural heritage of Afghanistan. And with this, I wish you an excellent and fruitful workshop to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ADG. And without further ado, I have a pleasure to invite Ms. Claire McGuire, who is the moderator of the first panel, and our dear colleague from IFLA, International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, to come to the podium and start with the first session. Thank you.
Dear participants, thank you very much for that introduction. And before I begin, can I invite the panelists to please join me here on the podium? Can I ask Mr. Mohammed Fahim Rahimi, Noor Agda Nouri, Masuma Nazari, and Philippe Marquis to join me here? As we heard, Afghanistan is a very rich country in terms of archaeological sites and diversity of cultural heritage. Unfortunately, since decades, this rich cultural heritage has been at risk from destruction, looting, illegal excavation, illicit trafficking, and unplanned development projects. Recent developments are worrying, especially in the north of the country. When addressing this issue, it is of utmost importance to gather as much expert information as possible. This panel will focus on the current situation of illicit trafficking in Afghan cultural property and share expert information on objects that are most at risk. We are fortunate to have today in this panel 4 prominent experts in Afghan cultural property. I will introduce each one as we proceed and then ask for their input based on their expertise. As we have a tight time schedule, I will ask you to please be precise and straight to the point, and I will indicate when you have a minute left. So without further ado, can I please introduce Philippe Marquis? He has had a long career as an archaeologist working in the Gulf countries, Pakistan, Oman, and Afghanistan. He is the former director of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan and worked in the country between 2004 and 2021. Mr. Marquis, since August 2021, DAFA has continued its activities remotely, primarily focusing on monitoring the evaluation of archaeological sites through various methods. Could you provide an overview of the current status of illicit trafficking of Afghan cultural property, any latest evolutions in terms of looting, illegal excavation, and illicit trafficking, and as you speak, what sources of information do you use to gather this material? So please, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about Afghan cultural heritage. I would like to thank Mr. Director Ottone and Director Krista Piquet, head of the emergency unit, as well as His Excellency, the Ambassador of Afghanistan, and also all my colleagues. I know that some of them are friends since a very long time. Well, I'm not going to be very long because there is a lot of people who are going to discuss this issue. May I have the first picture? So, as it had been already said, how important the archaeological potential of Afghanistan was. I'm going to not to extend too much on this. This is a map which is going, I would say, a short view of the density of archaeological sites and of the potential which could be, I would say, in danger from, I would say, both looting, but also development programs which could impair and interfere in archaeological sites. So what about the lootings? I would say Afghanistan has always been a country where looting of archaeological sites had been an activity. But recently, and especially since 2016 up to 2022, we have been witnessing an enormous increase in this looting, sites which were completely destroyed by this looting. The consequence of this looting is first that, I would say, a lot of very important scientific data had been destroyed or disappeared, but also we may suspect that a huge quantity of archaeological artifacts had been found during these lootings. And if we consider the input in terms of equipment and probably in terms of money in this looting, I would say people were sure to get, I would say, their payback from this investment. Development of looting in a context of political instability and in a context, and especially since 2021, a context where I would say local authority and especially local specialists in terms of cultural heritage, our colleagues from the Department of Archaeology of Kabul and of the Institute of Kabul had, I would say, more or less lost every support from the international community and have very, very few equipment to deal with this situation. What we are able to say is, from the looting and from, I would say, the fate of the objects which had been looted on the archaeological site, is that they are probably feeding a local market. We have next picture, please. I would say these are pictures of a local market. You can see, I would say, a picture which has been taken in 2021, and at this time there was already people selling antiquities. And some of them had been identified as, I would say, antiquity of valuable cultural, I would say, from, I would say, very important periods. This local market is feeding, I would say, next slide, is feeding private collection. This is a picture I took from a private collector. And you can see that these private collectors, they were in Kabul at least, they were buying everything. Manuscript, antiquities, but also artifacts which are much more related to the, we say, let us say, intangible heritage or handicraft. This is a part of the thing we can still be able to identify. But beside of this, it does seem that all these looted objects, sooner or later, these looted objects from the site, such as the one we have been seen before, are, I would say, on sale on the international market. On sale in the international market, and since, I would say, 2022, we've been able to, I would say, check and to try to follow up what had been the evolution of the international market. Obviously, there is, I would say, a very important role of the neighboring country. These neighboring countries are obviously involved in kind of transit operation before the final destination, which is the destination of the private collector, whether in Asia, whether in Europe, whether in the Gulf country. And what is traveling through these legal or illegal channels? What we have to consider, because that's something that we had learned to be aware of, is very important variety of what is on sale and the very, very various way the objects are sold. In fact, I would say we can divide all what is on sale in two big parts: the fakes and the real objects. And in between this, we have a huge variety of cases. Which make, I would say, the work of people involved in the custom, but also the people involved in cultural heritage, and also, and what is more important, what is making the work of people who want to have these objects back to the original location very difficult. Because as there is so much mixture in between the fakes, the real with, I would say, wrong origin, the real which had been tampered, not only, I would say, that manuscript, but you have statue which had been tampered. It's very difficult, in fact, when people from the custom are calling us about the identification of the object, to be sure that what has been caught in the custom is coming, as example for Afghanistan, or from another country. So I'm not going to discuss this more because it will take hours. And I'm giving back the floor to Claire McGuire in order to follow up.
Thank you very much. And moving along, I'd like to now pass the floor to Ms. Masuma Nazari, former director of the Afghanistan National Archives. Masuma Nazari served as the director of Afghanistan National Archives from 2013 to 2017. She obtained her first master's degree in library sciences and her second in manuscript studies. With expertise in libraries and archives, she previously worked in various library sectors and library practices in Afghanistan, including at the Attorney General's office. Having served as a cultural expert at the Economic Cooperation Organization in Iran until 2021, Ms. Nazari is currently a visiting scholar at the IMT School of Advanced Studies in Lucca, Italy, where she focuses in studying historic documents as part of Afghanistan's endangered documentary heritage. So I have two questions for you, Ms. Nazari. Having served as the director of Afghanistan's National Archives, what is the scale of illicit trafficking of Afghan manuscripts that you have witnessed? And aligned to that, according to your experience and expertise, what types of manuscripts are most at risk of illicit trafficking? So please, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I was director of the National Archive for 4 years, and during that time, also after that, I witnessed numerous cases and examples of illicit trafficking of manuscripts from Afghanistan. For instance, many manuscripts that had been cataloged in libraries in neighboring countries, and many manuscripts that were smuggled by people who didn't know they were doing smuggling, they were doing illicit trafficking, as well as many manuscripts that were handed over to us by police or custom of the airports. To illustrate how many manuscripts smuggled from Afghanistan, I take a very quick look at some key facts. In the year 1901, there were around 120,000 manuscript lithographic books, calligraphic works, and paintings in the Royal Library of Afghanistan. But later, with time, many of them stolen, smuggled, and looted from Afghanistan because of periods of wars and conflicts. For instance, in the uprising in 1928, as well as in the development in 1970 and 1978. Also during the Civil War and the first Taliban rule, we have lost many manuscripts from Afghanistan. I can say out of 120,000 manuscripts that one day preserved in the Royal Library of Afghanistan, only less than 4 to 5% of them transferred to the National Archive during the 1970 and 1980. And it indicates how many manuscripts we have lost during only 1 century because of wars and conflicts and unrest. I have some experience from illicit trafficking from specific cases. There were also many cases I witnessed, but some of them are so specific for me. For instance, we discovered that 9 early and precious manuscripts from the National Archive were lost during the 1990s, and we didn't know if they were lost from the archive during the Civil War or the first Taliban rule. And since the manuscript keeper had passed away, we were unable to follow up on this issue after 2 decades because there was no enough evidence to know what happened. But the thing that bothers me a lot and saddens me even to this day is when we realize that many manuscripts, many early manuscripts had been replaced with late and less precious one. And it was a disaster for the archive. And today I think it was because of lack of digitization, poor security system, as well as weakness in the inventory and cataloging system. That is why we have lost those manuscripts as well. Civil war and unrest helped to these things, to this happening. And after that, after August 2021, again, the opportunity for theft and illicit trafficking of manuscript resurfaced. I received several reports and news about specific cases that being smuggled from Afghanistan across the border into neighboring countries. And there was a rise in the number of people who wanted to sell their manuscript because of the situation as well as poverty. In general, I can say that both trading and smuggling, illicit trafficking of manuscript after August have raised. There was a raise in these things after in these 3 years. Here I have some pictures to share with you. The cases that have been stolen, smuggling from Afghanistan. These are examples of what smuggled from Afghanistan, and to show that these are manuscripts the most at risk for illicit trafficking. Number one is a manuscript that stolen from the Royal Library of King Amanullah Shah during the uprising in 1928, taken to Iran, and now is a part of the collection of National Library of Iran. I should mention that at that time, I mean after 1928, numerous manuscripts from Afghanistan stolen and taken to neighboring countries. And I know many manuscripts that catalog in libraries in Pakistan as well. Number two is another precious manuscript that stolen from the Kabul University Library during the development in 1978, taken to Pakistan and then Iran. After 27 years, was confiscated by us, and now it is housed in the National Archive. And the next, it's a recent case that is smuggled after August 2021, auction in October 2021. It's a precious Quran, unique Quran from the National Archive, and as you can see, has a interlined Persian, old Persian translation. Previously, it kept in the Royal Library of King Zahir Shah, and then during the 1918 transferred to the National Archive. And recently, unfortunately, stolen from the archive and auctioned in one of the European auction houses. This Quran has a really precious note on it, and later I will show you. The next Quran is also, it's a recent case that's stolen from the National Archive. It's a unique Quran from early Islamic century in Kufic script. 25 folios of this Quran put up for sale in 2022, and the next 25 auction in last year in 2023. This Quran has a long history in Afghanistan and famously known in Afghanistan as Quran of Imam Hassan. And the next slide is, as you can see, there are different seals and notes on these end folios and papers. These seals shows the ownership for this manuscript, and all of these seals erased from the copy that they smuggler put on the auction. But in the original copy, when it was still in the National Archive, I took that picture that in 2016, and all of the seals are fixed. These seals are from the different institutions, National Archive, National Library of Kabul, Kabul Museum, and Ministry of Culture. Just I wanted to mention one special and precious note on this manuscript. It's from a famous poet and press advisor for King Zahir Shah, indicating that this manuscript cataloged in 1955 by him. This note also erased. And the next, please. All these examples that you can hear are the most at-risk manuscripts from Afghanistan, including Qurans in Kufic script, Qurans with translation, old translation, Bactrian documents, pre-Mongol document and manuscript, and illuminated Qurans and manuscript. These are the most precious manuscript from Afghanistan as an example that smugglers are keen to take them out of Afghanistan and sell. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. If I can just follow up on that for, I think, speaking from the library sector as well, I think it is important to note in this context the rich documentary heritage tradition in Afghanistan, and you've touched on this a little bit. And documentary heritage, you have both the content and the carrier that you could lose. So the material, what we can learn from the actual written word, as well as the item as an object itself. So I would like to take a few moments just to bring a bit of an update from IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, some of the work that we have done, mostly through our partner, our Preservation and Conservation Center hosted at Qatar National Library. They are one of 14 preservation and conservation centers around the world, and they have launched in 2020 a project called Himaya that is focused on engaging international and regional organizations to strengthen and coordinate efforts to fight illicit trafficking and circulation of documentary heritage in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. There are a lot of specific challenges of this material. It's fragile, it gets less public attention, fewer legislative protections than other forms of cultural property. It is portable and usually easy to conceal. There tends to be less awareness among customs and border officers. In Afghanistan, as well as across the MENA region, a lot of this material is kept outside of official institutions. We've heard from some official institutions, but there's also libraries in private homes, in mosques, in private institutions holding precious material. And of course, libraries and archives can be targets around the world. Through our work and through the work of the PAC Center, there is a positive, noting that there is a special respect for the written word in Afghan folk tradition. So specifically in the context of Afghanistan, the Himaya Project has been able to intervene in the sale of around 12 Afghan manuscripts and Qurans, notably 8 in the last year. They have found through a network of experts and scholars important Quranic manuscripts for sale in the MENA region and in Europe. And I wanted to note that this project has seen some success in establishing good collaboration and cooperation between scholars and experts, between authorities, including Interpol, as well as between different points of sale, auction houses. And that has been a good partnership that's been able to come with some positive outcomes. In terms of key challenges looking forward, there's an urgent need for cataloging and digitization, and of course the capacity that goes along with that. One note in documentary heritage, and maybe we hear from others in other types of heritage, is sale on social media. So Himaya has found a lot of WhatsApp groups, TikTok now, where items are being sold, and that is much more opaque and difficult to intervene. And then again, that need for collaboration between all of these different partners, which is a reason we're here. So our PAC Center at Qatar National Library will be organizing training courses online and creating educational videos on trafficking of cultural property in Pashto and Dari languages. And we'll continue to work, especially in the social media space, to monitor illicit trafficking. So that's just a bit more context from IFLA's side and from Qatar National Library's side, who has been just an incredible partner in this to add to this conversation. So to move ahead, I'd like to hand over to Fahim Rahmini, the former director of Kabul National Museum. Fahim Rahmini is the former director of Kabul National Museum, director of Cultural Heritage of Afghanistan Conservation and Research Institute, and an expert in Afghan archaeology and ethnography. He holds a master's degree in anthropology and heritage preservation from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in archaeology and anthropology from Kabul University. He has also studied heritage preservation and curatorial practices in Vienna and Rome. From 2007 to 2023, he served as curator, chief curator, and the director of the National Museum of Afghanistan, respectively. He organized major exhibitions such as Anak, New Discoveries Along the Silk Road, Buddhist Heritage of Afghanistan, and 1,000 Cities of Bactria, and contributed to the International Preserved Treasures of Afghanistan exhibition. Mr. Rahmini, during your time as director of Kabul National Museum, you played a very important role not only in preservation and restoration of museums' collections, but also in the return and restitution of Afghan cultural objects. So, 2 questions for you. Could you show us some examples of return and restitution of cultural property within the last decade so we can get a sense of what type of cultural property is most at risk? What can you say about the current situation of Kabul National Museum? And also, you are currently working on the update of the red list of Afghanistan's antiquities at risk. So could you tell us a bit more about the types of objects that are most at risk? So please, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Claire. Well, I have been working, I have worked from 2016 until 2023 as director of the National Museum. And in the National Museum of Afghanistan, our activities fighting against illicit traffic of antiquity actually had 2 areas, 2 domains. We fought against illicit traffic of antiquity inside Afghanistan, and we controlled the customs. We worked together with the national institutions, customs, and also police security departments in national intelligence, police, and even national army. And through that, we established a department called the Department of Anti-Illicit Traffic of Antiquity and tracking of the smuggled artifacts from outside of Afghanistan. And before that, we only could control the Kabul National Airport, Kabul Airport, and but within establishment of this department, we expanded our activities in the provinces as well, and especially covered 4 major provinces where we normally had international borders. People crossed, and in Herat, Kandahar, Balkh, and also in Kunduz area. So here we hired at least 2 people in each custom department to specifically look after the objects, and normally the traders exported handicrafts through that, and they searched for the antiquity there, and they were quite useful, and they found a lot of artifacts actually through those channels. But also our activities outside of Afghanistan actually continued. We had connection with different institutions. Dr. Senjan is here. He is going to talk in the next panel. From the British Museum, colleagues from ICOM and also UNESCO and other departments, museums, institutions, DAFA. We have worked with many museums on tracking, identifying, and also stop seizing of these artifacts, but also returning of those artifacts. So we have worked with them, and we had many successful cases from 2016 until 2023 when I was in the National Museum. I can give you some examples of those objects. But for instance, we had inside Afghanistan, within the customs, actually, we confiscated a lot of objects, mainly here you can see in this slide. Islamic pottery, a lot of gold and silver precious coins, which was normally easy to transport, and we confiscated probably every year like thousands of these coins. And also the other very, the first slide please, other objects which were very commonly found by our department was Islamic metalwork, especially from the Ghaznavid and Ghurid period, early Islamic metalwork. And also you can see here in this photo a seal, a Bactrian seal, which was also a very common object that was found. We had also a lot of Buddhist objects. Here you can see a head of a Buddha, Bodhisattva. It's only one example of it. Next slide. And yeah, I mean, sometimes we found also manuscripts and also, again, the Islamic metalwork. And most importantly, we had some Buddhist freestanding statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas also found, I mean, in the customs. And also we have worked with to return it from outside of Afghanistan to Afghanistan. Next slide. And the other very common object that was actually unfortunately looted a lot is, you can see here, we have the relief from Buddhist period, and also the inscriptions, which are actually mainly came monumental inscriptions, and also we had gravestones, tombstones in different forms from the early Islamic period was one of the items that was normally we confiscated, and also we have many examples of it also from outside that I will show you later. And also glasses. Glass was also one of the very common tools that we found object in the custom. Every time that we take these objects confiscated from Kabul airport to the National Museum, at least 20 or 30% of those objects were glasses, that you can see an example here. But I want to show you also some other cases. We had a very, I do not have the photos here, but we have worked with the British Museum. Many times we returned objects, and it's very hard to actually say. I mean, what you saw is only a small part of what what is actually really found in Afghanistan. It's very diverse. The collection is very diverse, and I would say, I mean, probably only about 50% we could cover through these photos, but there are a lot of other objects, like a type of objects that's also taken, unfortunately, out of Afghanistan. So we had a case of returning many pieces together with our cooperation with the British Museum. We had a case also confiscated objects in New York, and we returned it back to Afghanistan. We had one case in Hong Kong. We worked with the colleagues there. We returned it. There are pieces also in Japan, and also there are pieces, especially marble pieces from the Ghaznavid period and outside of Afghanistan and within the museums, which we are working to return that as well. So those are the type of objects and cooperations that we had. And considering the current situation of the National Museum, the departments are active now. They are still working what we have based there. The custom colleagues in the custom are working there, and they try their best to actually stop the illicit export of the antiquity out of Afghanistan. So, and yeah, we are working on the red list together with the colleagues from ICOM. It's a group of experts, actually. These panel members are also part of that expert group. We are working to update the red list, and hopefully with the new items or a very good updated list, we will come up very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Amimi. And finally, I'd like to turn to Noor Agra Nouri. He is the former director of archaeology of the Archaeological Institute of Afghanistan and an archaeologist. He holds a master's of philosophy in archaeology from Hazara University, Pakistan. Priorly, he worked as a field archaeologist and a field director of Mezenak archaeological site, and also as curator of the National Museum of Afghanistan. He also worked with various international archaeological missions and has written and published various articles about Afghanistan's cultural heritage. So, Mr. Nouri, can you provide us with an update on the current status and condition of key archaeological sites in Afghanistan? And could you also talk a bit about the cultural objects at risk to be trafficked? So, please, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the director of UNESCO and her team here for organizing this wonderful workshop. And I also thanks to His Excellency Ambassador for coming here and following these activities very closely. Actually, this is an honor for me to be here in these workshops. And you all know that Afghanistan is facing internal conflict like almost 4 or 5 decades, and this impacted very badly on the destructions and looting of the cultural heritage sites throughout the country. And we have the evidence that through the past 4 or 5 decades, various archaeological sites have been looted and destroyed in different part of the country. So if I can name like Hadda site, the Mezenak site is also very famous site. It was also looted during this period, and later on like Surkh Kotal and Bagram and Ay Khanom, Tape Zargaran. So there are many sites that have been looted during this period. Before August 2001, when I was in charge of the Archaeological Institute, we have received documented evidence from various parts of the country where the illegal excavation was going on and the site was looted during this period. But unfortunately, until now, if I say that we don't have the exact numbers or the information that how many sites are excavated, illegally excavated, and the artifacts are looted. But currently, there have been documentation is going on by the Afghan organizations as well as our international partners. Next slide. Here in this slide, you can see some of the digging by the looters. These are very recent diggings, like after 2002, because we received 2021, I mean 22 and 23. So we received these evidences from various sources throughout the country, some colleagues and partners there, and they witnessed that the archaeological excavations, the illegal excavation in the archaeological sites are still going on. Here in this slide, you can see some of the sites in the north part of Afghanistan which has been documented and assessed by the Oriental Institute of the Chicago University. They did a very wonderful job, and they are assessing the archaeological sites that where the illegal excavation is going on, because before 2021, August 2021, we received reports from various parts of the country that in this part of in these archaeological sites the illegal excavation is going on. But unfortunately, due to security reasons, we didn't have access to reach to these sites. Therefore, we as we had a partnership with the Oriental Institute of Chicago University, we asked them to provide to do a satellite imagery assessment of these sites to see if there is some changes going on or what's happening in these sites. So luckily, but unfortunately, they provided a very good documents and which shows that the illegal excavation is going on, and you have saw these reports published some months ago in different channels and different medias have broadcasted this part. So as a whole, to your first question, I can say that the illegal excavation is still going on in different parts of the country in different archaeological sites. And the artifacts looted from these sites, here are some of the examples that I showed here in this slide, like one of the Dipankara Jataka you can see here. You know, this is a very scientific, significant tale which dates back to the 2nd and 4th century, and this relief came from Shuturak. So like this, there are various artifacts that looted from various parts of the country and exported outside of Afghanistan. Yeah. So okay. So yeah, those were the last slide, final slide. Yeah, these are the other examples of looted artifacts. One of the artifacts, though Fahim Rahimi explained about how these artifacts were exported and how they are trying to bring back these artifacts to Afghanistan. One of the interesting story about of these relief, this Ghazni marble that I have read sometime before, that was captured here in France and then moved to Germany, and from there it was given to the Afghan embassy in Berlin. One of the main problem is, beside this, that the artifacts have been looted and they reach to the black market. After this, when you identify these artifacts and when they have the proper provenance, when you want to bring back to Afghanistan, that is another big problem because of this political situation, because of this financial situations, and too many other things. That is also one of the big challenge that we need to work on this, that how we can solve this problem. So at the end, I just have a suggestion that we need to develop a kind of, because this is the fact that the illegal excavation is going on in Afghanistan, the artifacts are moving out easily to reaching to the black market. This is the fact. And what we can do after outside of Afghanistan, this is we need to think about, and we need to develop a kind of mechanisms. One of the things that I could propose is that maybe the people who are sitting here and who have this personal collections are buying these artifacts, and together with UNESCO, we can develop a kind of mechanism that they couldn't buy the artifacts coming from Afghanistan, and which have proper evidence, proper provenance, that could help to prevent this kind of illicit trafficking. Otherwise, if we paying to these people in huge amount, definitely we cannot stop, especially inside of Afghanistan, because of this volatile security situation. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I can just in 1 minute pull together everything we've heard here, a couple of key takeaways from the examples we've heard and seen today. There's a huge spectrum of types of cultural property that reflects a huge range of cultural and linguistic diversity, both currently and historically in Afghanistan. And the other point is, this is really a global issue, and there have been different stories here that we've heard of positive collaborations, and there's a real need for an ongoing strong international cooperation and coordinated effort. So with that, thank you to everyone for sharing your expertise and experience. Thank you to UNESCO for convening us all here today to continue on this strong international cooperation. So with that, I will close this first panel, and thank you all again, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much. I would like now to hand over to, without further delay, to our second panel that will now discuss available tools and challenges for the art market and museums in the fight against illicit trafficking and the exercise of due diligence. And I have the pleasure to invite our moderator of the second panel, Marc-André Renault, professor and director at the Art Law Center of the University of Geneva and UNESCO chair in international law of cultural property, to come here to the podium, and also to invite our distinguished experts to the podium. I will name them in the alphabetical order. So please come and join me, Mr. Abdulatif Mohamed Al-Rasmi, Ms. Sophie Carter, please. Mr. Yasmi is Director of Cultural Heritage Protection from Carter Museums. Sophie Carter, Global Head of Legal and Risk at Christie's. Mr. Nicolas Engel, Chief Curator in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan Collections, National Museum of Asian Arts at the Museum of Guinea. Ms. Marianne T. Kopelou, Coordinator at the Department of Heritage Protection at ICOM. Mrs. Rim Mitskani, Islamic art expert and founder of Rim Encher. Mr. Sanjon Simpson, archaeologist and curator in the Department of the Middle East at the British Museum, and Michel-Ange Stefano, Commandant for the Protection of Cultural Heritage at the Carabinieri. I now hand over to you, Marc-André, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Suna Altmuller, for your very a kind introduction, and I think we've heard a lot of very interesting elements to show us the background of what is happening in Afghanistan. And what we are now doing in this second panel is exactly what Noor Aghannouri said: develop mechanisms outside of Afghanistan and see what can be done in order to prevent or perhaps also enable the fight against illicit trafficking of Afghan cultural heritage. So we are now moving, if I may say so, outside of Afghanistan, and we're looking here what can be done. And one of the main elements that we all hear about now, we did not speak about that 25 years ago, but now we do, is the element of due diligence. Anyone active in the art market, anyone, be it museums, be it collectors, dealers, auction houses, everyone knows they have to be diligent. And this exists, this diligence standard, even though it has been, it exists, you know, on the books, has now been developed not only internationally, but also nationally. Due diligence is something that you find in the 1970 UNESCO Convention, named as under good faith, but it's really the same concept, the good faith purchaser. Due diligence is something that we also find in various EU regulations and directives. It's also something that is found in the more recent 1995 UNIDROIT Convention, to which many states are also a party. Due diligence, finally, is found in national legislation. It is found in case law, and judges who are looking into cases in which the issue of restitution arises, for example, look at the notion of due diligence. Look if the purchaser did the right thing. So I think our panel today is exactly going to be looking at this. How and what elements do does the market? Do museums also have to look into? Do collectors have to look into? Do law enforcement officers also have to look into in order to decide whether a particular person has acted in due diligence or preventively? Are you diligent in what you are intending to do? So this involves, of course, consulting registers, verifying the identity of buyers and sellers, ascertaining the origin of the funds at stake, and a lot of many other things. So we have today a great panel to deal with this. I think the first person I'm going to give the floor to is Nicolas Angel, curator in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan collections at a museum here in Paris, the National Museum of Asian Arts, Musée Guimet. And I'd like to ask you, Monsieur Angel, if knowing exactly the historical background of objects, has it become an important element for museums? And do you know if new initiatives have been taken in order to train people who are working for museums to precisely be diligent whenever it comes to acquiring or receiving as a donation particular objects from Afghanistan? And what are the major hurdles that you would see that museums face? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I will speak in French.
J'allais le dire, vous pouvez parler français.
So, effectivement,
I was about to suggest it. Yes, do please feel free to speak French. This due diligence dimension of things is clearly a major issue for museums, and not just for museums, also for the training of students, with the creation of a master's program that focuses on identifying provenance at the École du Louvre. We have seen the recruitment of research specialists in a number of museums who specialize in provenance, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but also the Quai Branly Museum at the Musée Guimet. We have a colleague, Lise Mess, who has joined us to start setting up a research and documentation center, as well as research into provenance. Now, as far as museums are concerned, of course, the idea is always to acquire new works, enrich the collections, and we continue to work with art markets and auction houses, but we have a process for acquisitions with internal commissions, certainly at the Guimet Museum, and also within the Ministry of Culture that we are attached to. Territorial museums have a similar system with regional collections and acquisitions, which are manned by the DRAC administrative entities. And at the Musée Guimet, since we have a large department of Asian arts, we see all the requests from territorial museums that have to do with Asia go by, as well as the requests for export certificates from auction houses or gallery owners in preparation for the acquisition of a work by a foreign collector. So we are not here to judge whether a work is authentic or not, or what its price estimate should be, but rather to judge the question of whether this work is or not in a position to leave the national territory. And I'd like to talk about a specific case of an acquisition for money, which is part of a private collection in Hong Kong. The owner wished to sell it to us. This is very much a major work. It would have been perfect for the Guimet Museum's collections. Carbon 14 analysis and pigment analysis has enabled its date to be ascertained. It's from the 2nd century, and it shows a Kushan sovereign with some dignitaries. Some of these dignitaries are military, others are Zoroastrian priests, and this is a painting on cotton, the provenance of which has not been verified. It was acquired in 1992 in Hong Kong by the current owner, but as to its earlier history, this is based on oral accounts. And even when we contacted the gallery owner in Hong Kong, she was not able to provide us with any more documentation than the invoice from 1992. So despite the great value of this interest, which was published in the minutes of the Academy of Belles Lettres many years ago, and we're going to see it used in the forthcoming work on the Kushan. This is a work which cannot clear the successive stages of commission approval, and above all of the Ministry of Culture, whether it's at the museum or the Ministry of Culture. That's just one example, a very practical and recent one, which I wanted to give you, of a work which cannot be made part of our collections at French national museums. Well, thank you very much. Perhaps I could ask you a further question on this. This is an orphaned work, an orphaned cultural property, since all we have about this is an invoice and nothing before that. Absolutely. This is a work that could have been produced in Bactria, according to researchers in northern Afghanistan then, and potentially may have been kept in a dry environment, given its excellent state of conservation, from Amu Darya to Xinjiang, for example, the Taklamakan Desert, say. And according to its history, it may have moved through the safes of Tibetan monasteries and then been taken by Tibetan refugees to Nepal and ultimately made it to Hong Kong. That is the story behind this work, but it is certainly orphaned. We don't have its provenance, nor do we have, above all, the official documents that would attest to its legally leaving the territories that it was in before Hong Kong in 1992. So I deduce from this then that the museum did not purchase it, did it? It didn't. Did it consider the question of possibly acquiring it and then publishing information about it, so that if a state or a local authority, or indeed an individual, were to come forward and say, actually this comes from us, from, for example, from the north of Iran, from Bactria or wherever, in with a view to restitution, is that something that was considered, or was it too much of a hot potato? Well, I mean, there was some of that. You know, this is a work which has been published on 4 separate occasions in Japan as part of a temporary exhibition, for instance, in Yokohama. It is a work which is known and which resurfaces from time to time. Indeed, at the museum, we had seen it proposed to an earlier set of responsible people at the museum, and perhaps the acquisition would have been possible in the late 90s or early zeros, but as things currently stand, it's simply unthinkable for us. What is the difference between now and then? Well, if the museum acquires this work, it has to be registered in its inventory, and it becomes inalienable. It can no longer leave the public collection, so that even if you were to acquire it with a view to subsequent restitution, that would be a problem. And indeed, the state concerned would have to formulate the request. As things currently stand in Afghanistan, I don't believe the authorities would be able to make a request for restitution to the French state. But when it comes to Asia, to the Afghan collection of our museum. Most of it comes from the DAFA, the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan. And there was a Franco-Afghan 1922 agreement on the sharing of collections, so that our collections are actually not, exposed to requests for restitution, certainly for that part associated with the DAFA. Of course, the question could arise in other contexts, say Cambodia, for example, but that is not relevant for Afghanistan.
Case of a museum facing an object with very little, if possibly no provenance. Let me move to our next speaker, Abdulatif Al-Jasmi, who is all over there. On my extreme right is, as was already said, the Director of Cultural Heritage Protection at Qatar Museums. He oversees both the physical and legal protection of cultural property, as well as the enforcement of international codes and conventions. So, Abdulatif, in cooperation with the regional UNESCO offices, as well as UNESCO chairholders and international legal scholars, you have recently worked on a complete revamp of the national cultural heritage legislations of Qatar, which pays a lot of tribute to the movement of property, working with conflict zones, such as Afghanistan, and also efforts for registration and tracking of movement based on existing case studies or actual seizures. So this is really a very interesting project. Could you give us some details about the status of this legislative project and its importance in Qatar? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Renaud. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Director Piquet and the team. When it comes to the new law, we have to always start with what was the problem with the status quo. So basically, we had a situation where the existing legislation is about 45 years old. It addresses only antiquities and archaeology, so there is absolutely no concept for registration of movement or checking authenticity, checking provenance. But where that becomes a regional problem is what changed in Qatar since 1980 when the existing law was written. And basically what was once a very modest country became an economic frontrunner, and suddenly you have an entire generation, an entire community of collectors with very strong purchase power, with a big chain of museums coming suddenly to the country, situated near several conflict zones, not just Afghanistan. We're talking about Iraq, we're talking about Syria, Yemen, Sudan, among others, located somewhere between East and West, with a national carrier with one of the most extensive network of airlines in the world, and you suddenly have a problem. You have a recipe for a problem, if you may. And usually with such struggles, unfortunately, the communities struggle, and then hunger wins, and then there's somebody waiting to exploit the situation. So basically, the first line of defense is a transit situation. As my colleague Nouri has mentioned, sometimes it's too difficult to solve the problem once it has reached its destination. So when you have a conflict situation near you, and you are a potential hub or a potential transit state, that's the easiest opportunity to reverse the action, if you may. And basically, you're able to identify the trends if you're sitting in that situation. So with the new law, we elected to dedicate an entire chapter just to the movement of cultural property. So addressing not just provenance checks, but even the mechanism related to movement, temporary movement, donations, exchanges, endowment, and so on and so forth. And the drafting process was not just based on the status quo in Qatar or on regional and international laws, but we actually examined how objects were being smuggled from countries like Syria, like Egypt, like the situation now in Sudan. And we worked for almost 5 years now just to kind of put mechanisms and put articles that are accepted, not just locally, but would be accepted by the originating state, so that it could address the problem of the rate. I'm happy actually to state today that the law will be rolled out in about a month from today, having completed the legislative cycle with the state and the parliament. But what's ironic, Professor Renaud, is that we thought it would be a lot more difficult to capture the trends, but sitting next to several conflict zones, you can almost time it to the dot. That, for example, 2 years into every conflict, you see a sudden spike in trafficking. That before any important object is being trafficked, you suddenly see a surge of coins popping all over the place, sort of to kind of test the waters and test the different shipping mechanisms, and that in many cases, the objects are not looted. They are not replicas. They're not with forged documents. They're actually imported legally. But because they sit in a conflict zone, you have quasi-laws, you have shadow governments, and you have basically the misfortune of the underprotected and the unfortunate being exploited in a situation with weak laws, either in the transit situation or at the site of conflict, basically.
Thank you so much. And do you see Qatar as possibly playing a role as a transit state, as you said, in stopping the transit of looted, if we're not talking about what is legal, but what is illegal, and stopping what has been looted, for example, in Afghanistan? Do you think that would be an option?
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, for the public to be informed, usually it requires regulations that apply to them. So basically, as long as the regulations don't apply to you personally, there is nothing to be informed on. Mm-hmm. So by updating regulations, by updating statutory requirements, you're forcing collectors, museums, shipping companies, art handlers, facilitators, exhibition coordinators, and so on, to actually understand the requirements for shipping, so you can absolutely interrupt. And I mean, I can specifically mention, for example, that there was a case that happened 2 weeks ago that we were able to stop. There was a collection that has left Syria, that landed somewhere in Europe, and then it went back to Qatar to be auctioned to another destination, a third destination. Yet the documents were all original. There was nothing that was forged. There were court orders in order, but there was one issue with the shipment. All of the objects were stamped with an Islamic endowment, or what we call a waqf. So knowing what that is, it's untransferable, it's permanent, it cannot be canceled, it cannot be loaned. So even though it was being transported originally, you have to go beyond the legality of it and examine the ethicality of it and say, look, I cannot let this through. I have to notify the originating country.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this very recent case. In fact, and what happened? Was it stopped? Was it?
It's still in Qatar, and we're in negotiating with our counterparts back in Syria, and we'll decide what's the best for the objects themselves.
Thank you very, very much. Now we move on to Sophie Carter, who is Global Head of Legal and Risk at Christie's. And a director and company secretary for Christie's International PLC. She has joined Christie's in 2008 and co-chairs the Global Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Christie's Fund. So it is great to have you with us, Sophie. I know you are very aware of this issue of provenance and due diligence. We have already met in other fora where we discussed these issues. Do you follow a special protocol regarding research? I mean, you, Christie's. Does Christie follow a special protocol regarding a research into the provenance of objects coming from Afghanistan and more generally from countries in conflict?
Yes, we do. Let me start by saying that the continuing looting of archaeological sites and the destruction of historic buildings continues to be a major concern for us in the art market. And we truly believe that we all need to play our part in sending a clear message to those who participate in the illicit trade in cultural property, that property looted and trafficked cannot be sold in the open market. And we believe that it's not just for us, but for other players in the art market. So yes, we do extensive due diligence and provenance checking when we receive objects, particularly from conflict areas. We first of all ensure that we are always adhering to all relevant laws, bilateral treaties and regulations that apply in the sale site. And the critical element of that is really that due diligence on provenance and going back as far as we can to check how long an object has been out of its country of origin, whether or not it contains the right paperwork. To your point, Abdul Latif, the import and export paperwork is critical to understand the journey of that object, and really to make sure that the story makes sense. We unfortunately see everything that you mentioned, and talking to Philippe earlier, what he sees of fake documentation, sometimes documentation that actually belong to an alternative object. And all of these are things that we need to be investigating to try to prove that it has not been taken out of a conflict area. We do what we call enhanced due diligence, particularly for countries where there is conflict. The difficulty for us is, as Claire and others mentioned, is the lack of inventories and catalogues. And we really appreciate the work that the Maya project has done, and we have worked with the Maya project on certain objects to find out if they know about whether the item has recently come out of a conflict zone, particularly Afghanistan. And there was a recent very interesting article about sadly, what's happened to the National Archives and the amount of works that have disappeared from there. So what we need is really more experts, more inventories, and people to help us. So again, we really appreciate the work that was happening on the ICOM list to add more Afghan pieces. If we are approached, we obviously hope that we get it right the first time. If we put something into our catalogues and somebody approaches us, which does occasionally happen, then we take that seriously and we will look at that item and work out whether we should take it out of the sale, and we often do, whilst we then continue to research the work.
Thank you. And obviously, so does it happen that you refuse works because of the provenance, the lack of provenance?
Absolutely. Yes, it absolutely does. Anything that makes us give us concern, or stories that don't make sense, whatever it is, but we always want verifiable documentation to prove how long an object has been out of its country of origin, preferably if it's available, import-export paperwork. Unfortunately, objects that have been out of their country of origin for a long period of time often don't, because people didn't think it was important to keep that information. It really is only in the last few decades that people have actually started to realize the importance of that. But certainly, looking back at periods of 60s, 70s, anything before that, 80s even, you rarely, it can be very difficult to have all the export paperwork. So then we are looking at how long has it been out of the country of origin, and is there anything that gives us concern about when it may have come out that could make us believe that it was actually looted or that it was illegally exported.
And for example, would a case similar to that Nicolas Angel mentioned, a beautiful object, but with a nice story, seems credible, but only based on oral argument or oral history. Would you advise to take that, or would you be very reluctant?
We would be very reluctant, I have to admit. We really try to rely not simply on an we normally we always want an affidavit, so a signed legal document. Of course, unfortunately, people can lie in those documents. So we do really want documented evidence. And the truth is, we're also protecting our buyers, particularly the more valuable the item is. The truth is, many of them are being bought by institutions, and they will require that level of documentation as well. So we will be very nervous if there was, however beautiful it was. In fact, the more beautiful, the more rare it is, the more concerned we are if there's no paperwork.
Yes, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I am told there has been a technical issue for those who are online. Apparently, participants could not access the English translation or version of our event. We think it's fixed now, I'm told. But if not, whoever is listening, and I believe there are quite a few people listening to us, please send an email to the organizers, Convention 1970, all in one, at UNESCO.org. Now, you just said, Sophie, that you were cooperating with ICOM. Well, it is so nicely planned that we now have a specialist from ICOM. Marianti Copelou, you are a coordinator at ICOM Secretariat Heritage Protection Department, an archaeologist in training. You have participated in various archaeological expeditions on different sites in Greece, and research on the field in Greek, Roman, and Byzantine antiquities, centered on the Mediterranean basin. Now, we've heard during the first panel, and again, others have already mentioned the red lists of ICOM. We know they're important because they sensitize the public to the importance of illicit traffic, and also they are used as a tool to put in effect the due diligence that is required. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more on these red lists. How are they established, and how can they really help in alerting the art market and the museums?
Thank you very much, Professor Renaud. Thank you very much, UNESCO, for organizing this important series of raise awareness workshops against illicit trafficking on cultural property. I think it's a very crucial momentum for us to see together all what we have available tools in our disposal to fight this global phenomenon, and what kind of responsible actions we could take can be taken by all actors involved, both in the protection of cultural heritage and in the art market. I'm glad that I have this opportunity to draw your attention to one of the most significant tools that ICOM has to combat the illicit trafficking, the red list of cultural goods at risk, which, as Mr. Renaud correctly mentioned, are not only important as raise awareness tools, but foremost are practical operational tools, instruments in the hands of museum professionals, heritage professionals, law enforcement agencies, consumer officials and art market actors to act proactively, namely to disrupt the illicit trade and trafficking of cultural property. But first of all, what is the red list? What's the objective? It's important to understand that it's not a list of stolen objects, but rather a list of objects susceptible to be stolen or looted, illegally excavated or traded. In other words, the red list indicates different categories of objects, different typologies of cultural goods with high risk to be illicit trafficked. These cultural goods are examples of inventoried, documented objects in museum institutions, and they are protected by the legislation of the country of their origin. In this way, the red list aims to prevent the illegal circulation and acquisition of cultural goods inside and outside the country of origin, and eventually contributes to their recovery and restitution. When ICOM initiates the creation of a red list, relies on the contribution of an appointed working group of national experts, specialists in different disciplines, archaeology, history, ethnography, art history, that will specify the category of cultural objects. The choice of the cultural objects that the experts are being called to make is particularly crucial and difficult, if I may say, because it must not be based on the uniqueness of the object or its importance in terms of research, of scientific research, but instead has to meet specific criteria. First of all, its vulnerability, how much it is exposed to the trade, which is the scale of its demand on the art and antiquities market, and its legislative, of course, safety net, namely the national and international framework of the country of which it originated and therefore are protected. Further to this prerequisite, the cultural objects inscribed in the red list are giving all the necessary information about their identity, their high definition image, as well their explicit description of content, type, material, date of creation, and most important, place, location of the creation discovery, and therefore its provenance, can lead to the identification of the suspicious illegally circulated object. How that actually is made in practice. From the moment that the cultural object reach the hands of the custom officer or a law enforcement agent, the red list functions as a warning flag for the under question cultural objects and facilitates their identification and eventually their seizure. At the same time, though, the red list, by identifying specific categories of objects with documented their origin of provenance, indicate in the most plausible manner the cultural goods that must not enter into the art and antiquities market, and therefore can be used as an enhanced due diligence instrument for any potential buyer, possessor of cultural property.
And thank you very much. Now, on the Afghanistan list, it is, you said it's being updated, right? Could you give us maybe a little bit more detail on how advanced is the project?
Yes, from the beginning of 2024, ICOM Heritage Protection Department began putting in place the update version after many years, as it has already been mentioned, from 2008. The red list for Afghanistan antiquities. So following the assistance of UNESCO by providing us a list of group of experts, we are here in the previous panel, they are here. We are created a working group of specialists that can enable us to to begin with the update. There was appointed coordinator, Mr. Fahim Rahim, the former director of National Museum in Kabul. And then as the first steps of this implementation, we asked from the experts to examine carefully their current red list and see in what terms this list is, what kind of object have to be remain or have to be replaced and have to be changed or modified according to the vulnerability. Because as we already know that illicit trafficking landscape change and the needs change, the demand change. And then we asked for first preselection of objects that has to be made of the object to reconsider the categorization and subcategorization of this object. The experts proposed to us that some new objects has to be included in the red list. They're actually very important. Some of them, we have already seen them from the previous panel. And at the moment, we are working on the finalization of the new updated version with a new proposed list. And we are talking about the ownership of the new museums that actually the ownership of the images of the objects.
So you're nearly there. This year it should be published?
Yes.
Okay.
At the end of this year.
At the end of this year. And if I may, does it ever happen, this is a very practical question, but does it ever happen that you have feedback? So a law enforcement or officer or custom officer calls ICOM and says, I see this object that looks very much like something that is on your red list. Can you help me? Does that ever happen?
We wish to happen, although we have many cases that for actual practical use of the red list. For instance, from Libya, I have shown the example where a marble statue has been seized and has actually exhibited as exhibited in the Musée du Louvre. Unfortunately, and this is something that we really want to know, we have not so many, let's say, success stories. We have success stories, but are not concrete. We are very, very eager to have more, to learn more from our partners, from Interpol, from law enforcement agencies, for custom officers, so that we can see the actual, in a concrete manner, the efficiency of the red list. And that's why we constantly call our partners to give us evidence, to provide us this evidence. But sometimes the difficulty occurs from the red list practice, from the red list nature. It's an operational, quick tool that is being used quite directly, and the partners, the law enforcement, has no time actually to say, yes, we used it, and so it's practical and efficient. So that's the main difficulty.
So it's mainly really an awareness-raising tool for those who are involved, right? Yes, in the art market, in the law enforcement.
Raise the awareness, yes. But mostly I would say operational tool.
Operational.
Operational tool, yes.
Great, thank you so much. Et maintenant,
and now I'm going to hand over the floor to my neighbor to my left, Rim Mezgani, who is an expert in Islamic and Indian art. In 2009, she created Rim's Art. And Rim's Art is specialized in Islamic and Indian art. And Rim's Art aims at promoting expertise and issuing opinions, and also organizing private sales in the area of institutional art. So my question for you is the following. Ms. Mezgani, what are the actions that you undertake when you have serious doubts about a cultural good? How do you deal with objects that come from countries that are affected by conflict, like Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Well, thank you very much. As you said, I'm a specialist in Islamic art. Therefore, every day I'm contacted to estimate the value of artifacts, often with just a picture and very little information on the provenance of the object. Sometimes these requests come from sellers that I know, whose practices I know and that I trust, but we also very often have some requests with just a picture from somebody we've never heard of. And these requests might come via email, but also through social media. And it's true that a lot of people do get in touch with us through social media. If they want an estimate, if they want some expertise, they will reach out through Instagram, Facebook, and the like. So the very first reaction that we have is to, first of all, ask where the object is currently sitting, in which country. So here I'm talking about sensitive objects that come from sensitive regions. So we ask where the object is currently located. We ask for the size of the object. We ask also for more pictures, because in our process we try and also hold on to as much information as possible, even for objects that we're never going to put up for sale, or objects for which we're not going to give any expertise or feedback. We still try to get hold of as much information as possible. And either we get a lot of feedback from the person, a lot of pictures, information, in which case I will meet up with the person. I never give an opinion on an object just based on pictures. I need to actually see it and see the person that has the object at the moment, and I don't give any estimate on the market value of the objects, at least not until I am sure that the provenance has been verified and that everything is sound. So, of course, this narrows down quite significantly the number of artifacts that can end up being put on sale by myself and my institution. And so, as soon as I have the provenance from the person who has the object, and even if I do have some documents that testify to that, like export documents or a certificate that states that this object was bought to Mr. Something for X amount, as soon as I have a doubt, then I reach out to my network, and I don't necessarily have a lot of practical information on who to reach out to. I just use my own knowledge and experience and get in touch with experts who might know this kind of object, who done some research or thesis on that kind of object, or people who work in museums and who could maybe advise me or point me in the right direction. I also take a look at databases, IDR, for example, or Interpol. But it does require a lot of work on my part. So if I have documents about the provenance, and if I have no doubt about the person that has the object, then I can proceed to selling it. We also rely quite a lot on the rules that fight against money laundering. No location, no supplier is the rule. When we have a private collector whom we've known for a long time, it's a different story. For example, I remember an older gentleman recently who has a Raznavid pottery glass, pottery and green tiles. Now the value is not very high for this artifact, but for me it's a red flag because it's a sensitive project, because it's an architectural feature and it comes from Afghanistan. And the gentleman told me that he bought it in 1970 when he traveled abroad with the Association of the Friends of the Louvre Museum. So I did a lot of research. I was able to track back this journey. There was a newspaper article about that trip with some pictures. So I was able to piece together a consistent and coherent timeline for that particular item. And with museums, with databases, I realized that, okay, we could put this object up for sale. And regarding objects that come from conflict-affected areas, you have to be very careful. And if you can't trace all the way back to the origin of the object, then your answer must be no. In other words, if there is a single piece of doubt, then you should say no and not put the object out for sale. And therefore, I imagine that you often say no. Yes. Okay, well, thanks for that answer. Well, not only do we say no, by the way, I don't know to which extent other people are aware of this, but you really mustn't give any market value estimate on the basis of pictures, because the numbers that you'll give out are then going to be used, and often they're going to motivate people to sell or buy the object. Sometimes people will send us a picture and ask us for an estimate to know whether they're going to buy it or not, whether they are paying the right price for it. So it's very important to not give any information about a potential price of the object until you've secured its provenance. So has it happened that, if you've gone through the whole process, you end up by saying, yes, okay, we can put it up for sale, and at the moment of the sale or just before, you receive a message, an alert from a government, or there's a red flag that comes up and say, okay, do not sell this object, and you have to kind of backtrack. Well, it's not happened to me, but I know that it has happened on the market. There are two sides to this question. First of all, in France, we're very lucky in that there is a lot of support and a lot of controls when it comes to selling such artifacts. So there is some regulation on the arts markets and for auction houses particularly. So we can rely on them to know how to respond to a situation. If we've put it up for sale, it's because we believe that there's no problem. And then a third party might come up and might say, okay, maybe this object shouldn't be for sale. Like the Quran, for example, who was immediately identified thanks to a picture in an inventory, and that allowed us to trace it back to Afghanistan. So there it was obvious we had to not put it up for sale, because it's just not ethical to go through with the sales process. And sometimes it's a bit less obvious, and in those instances we have to rely on a legal opinion depending on the country of origin and what are the legal aspects that need to be followed. Well, thank you very much for this answer.
Come back to the world of museums with St. John Simpson, who is an archaeologist and curator at the Department of the Middle East at the British Museum. He has directed and co-directed several surveys and excavations in the Middle East and Central Asia, and his core research is on late antique and early medieval material culture from Iraq, Iran, Caucasus, Persian Gulf, and Central Asia. He published on a wide range of other topics, ranging from ancient South Arabia and Afghanistan to Bronze Age finds from Central Asia and Eastern Iran. He was also a curator of an exhibition entitled Afghanistan, Crossroads of the Ancient World, which was organized exclusively with loans from the National Museum of Afghanistan. Mr. Simpson, what are the due diligence procedures in place at the British Museum? From your perspective, what can museums do to advance actions in the fight against illicit trafficking and to ensure the exercise of due diligence?
So at the British Museum, we have a very high level of due diligence, and we have had for a very long period of time. So we follow international laws, the national laws of all the countries in question. That's our primary go-to. The UNESCO Convention, 1970. There's also the Dealing in Cultural Objects Offences Act of 2003, which is a UK law. And last and not least, we adhere to a policy of individual curator liability. So if a curator wishes to acquire an object, which is extremely unlikely or possible these days, that person has to personally sign on the dotted line that they have followed all levels of due diligence. So this policy extends to dealing with the public, so we will not give valuations to any private individuals. We will seek information from them on what levels of due diligence they have followed if they ask us for our opinion about the age of an object. If we believe that the object has been possibly stolen or trafficked, we advise them accordingly. And we act sometimes to help return the object back to the host country if we can show that it's been stolen. And so we have worked particularly with members of the UK art market, Johnny Eskenazi and Christie's particularly, very successfully in ensuring that privately owned pieces are returned with no bounty back to particularly the National Museum of Afghanistan. Finally, we will not borrow or display objects without strong evidence of a due diligence. So I think that's our position. Where I think museums can do more is to use the oxygen of publicity through international media on the relations we hold, particularly with other national museums and other institutions. And the concrete examples I'll give is where objects have been trafficked, identified through the BM, and ready for repatriation. We then have agreements in place with 5 countries so far to display those objects temporarily in a prominent place in the museum, attract all of the UK stakeholders, whether government or other, to that case, and then publicize this display and return through the international media. And so we've done this very successfully with Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. So those are 5 cases where we've done this successfully, and we've got agreements in principle from several other countries if the need arises.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting perspective, the one that you described at the end of your remarks. I know that other institutions follow the same ideas. The Louvre has done that, and locally, my local museum in Geneva also has done that. Interestingly, there was in Switzerland some criticism as to museums doing that, saying, but this is not the role of the museum. You are actually somehow publicizing the effects of looting. So somehow you are encouraging illicit activities. How would you respond? I'm not saying I agree with this, but this has been said.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is said in the UK, but how would you respond to that?
So the role of a museum is very varied. And of course, the primary role of any museum is to safeguard, promote, research its own collections. But an international museum has a higher stage presence and a higher international and ethical priority to do more than that, to go beyond the borders of its own collections. And so in the case of Britain, the British Museum acts as the primary go-to advice council for all areas of UK law enforcement, primarily UK border force. I think we will increasingly see our role working more closely with the National Crime Agency, who have new powers, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. We also work closely with the Art Loss Register, Arts Council, and the World Customs Organization. And so through all of those partnerships, we have shown that we're all joined up, and that, to give examples and numbers, for Afghanistan, we've identified, displayed, published, and returned to Kabul something like 2,300 objects of all periods from the Bronze Age through to the ethnographic. We've helped inform and launch that 2008 Red List, and it's great to see it now being revised and updated. Some of those objects that we've helped identify and return have been objects stolen from the National Museum that we've heard about. So Kushan ivories from Bagram, sculpture from Sukh Kotal, from the temple, one of the largest Buddhist sculptures from the National Museum in Kabul, and an inscribed Safavid metal bowl, which was bought in good faith in Jeddah from an Afghan antiquities dealer, we believe, by a private couple then working in Saudi, who tried to sell it through London. It was recognized by Christie's, brought to us, and then the very sensitive discussions were pursued involving the private owners, Christie's, and ourselves, and the National Museum, to ensure that the best thing, the only possible thing could be that was really possible, was that the object should be handed over and that we could see that it goes back to its rightful owner. And working with the embassy, Afghan embassy in London, very closely, very quietly, discreetly, we organized that handover so that it was immediately before the arrival in London of former President Hamid Karzai and then President Ashraf Ghani, and the object was handed over to those individuals on the grounds of the embassy in Kabul. And I know Mr. Rahimi then got a call shortly afterwards to go to the presidential palace to collect that object in person. And so I think those examples give the strongest possible message that we're doing the right and moral thing. And What I would appeal, though, for guidance from all of you and from the world is what we do in future when other objects are identified in London or Paris or wherever that we know are stolen property. What do we do then? Can we hold them? Who holds them legally? Who do we return them to? And when do we return if it's a conflict zone? And we know of cases, some of us know in this room of particular cases, and it's a real problem under international law as to know what to do. So, and final, perhaps a follow-up if I've got time, to highlight this issue of transparency and publication. So we published several things about the ivories that were stolen from the National Museum that were returned through working with a collector. And in terms of red lists, we get a lot of positive feedback from Border Force and World Customs Organization about the power of the red list. And we do training and skills sharing with all of those parties. And anyone who doesn't know about it, it's possible to get it. In February 2020, we ran a big article in the World Customs Organization newsletter, which goes to every Border Force customs agency in the world, feature article on this work that we do, featuring case studies from Afghanistan and other countries. So I think those cases show it works.
Thank you very much indeed. What you said just before giving those examples of publicity, what should a museum do with with stolen items that are identified, be there in its collections or in others, and especially if they come from conflict zones, leads to the issue of should museums somehow be considered as safe havens, place where pieces of art should be kept safely until the times change and they can eventually be returned. Would you see the British Museum as possibly being a safe haven? I'm speaking of those specific cases of conflict zones, right? Like perhaps Afghanistan or others.
Yes, I mean, it's a hot...
Microphone, please. Thank you.
It's a hot topic, we know, and there are issues of liability, legal ownership, intellectual property ownership, copyright in a sense, of those objects. Speaking personally, I would say that if institutions are going to do this, it would be good to get a strong moral support from a wide range of stakeholders, and especially from those individuals who are from those host countries in question, whether in country or displaced, and that if we have support and a green light to go forward, then the best public benefit, I would say, is to put them on display, not to hide them, be secretive, and raise further questions as to what the motives could be, but to display them and say, in all honesty, we're working in partnership for a brighter future. But that's my personal view.
Maybe je peux me tourner vers Monsieur Angel. Que pensez-vous de cette idée?
And I'll turn now to Mr. Engel. What do you think of the idea of museums being a tool, microphones off, being a tool for more publicity around, let's call them problematic artifacts? Well, just like Mr. Simpson, I would say that yes, indeed, museums can provide shelters, safe havens for these orphaned objects. But then there's another issue. We cannot hold within our reserves things that don't belong to us. So museums could serve as shelters. I think that some museums do that in Qatar, for example, for the manuscripts. But then, you know, there are legal issues, and also our Ministry of Culture would have to be in favor of that option, and we also work with experts in manuscripts or Fahim from the National Museum. We need at least a tacit agreement, in fact, more than tacit, much more than tacit, to house objects that are not the property of the museum.
Qatar museums. Maybe, Abdulatif, you would like to say something on this particular aspect of being a safe haven?
I would echo what my colleague St. John has mentioned, is that there are a lot of moving parts and there are a lot of stakeholders to get approval from. For example, even though we do serve as a safe haven, we still have an issue of government indemnity. And it costs a lot of money to insure objects that in many cases will never be displayed. There is no, let's say, focus on their status in Qatar, and the efforts to restitute them are on hold because of political conflict or unrest or a situation like that. So what we keep at heart is the preservation of the objects, for lack of a better term. So as long as that is the main goal, then we're willing to accept the responsibility. But if it's, let's say, for the sake of trying to, for lack of a better term, complete a collection that you have, or complete a display, or endow or enhance an exhibition, then we absolutely pull rank. This is not something that we follow.
Mrs. Copperu, you would like to say something on
yes,
e-commerce
we have
perspective?
Museums, from the perspective mostly of the code of ethics of museum, that actually I think that not only pose the problem of what Mr. Simpson said about displaying the exposition. Normally, according to the code of ethics, you cannot display actually a stolen object. But however, in the meantime, at the same time, we have to think about what the other point of the code of ethics about the educational role of the museum, and raise awareness of people and publicity, and informing the public about the question of illicit trafficking and illicit trade, and even for orphan objects and provenance objects. So it's the way of exhibition is to pose the problem and inform people about the problem, and why not through the exhibition there were, for instance, the object in question can find its legal owner at the end.
Would maybe a compromise be to say that museums should show stolen objects, but not necessarily exhibit them in the sense of a nice exhibition with, you know, artistic research. No, it's really only show looted items, so to educate, so to show this educational perspective first.
In the context.
In their context.
Of disputed, yes.
Absolutely. So we have made a very clear position in our display that we are showing objects in this case that are not part of our collection, that are there just for a very short period of time, and we've highlighted the display with a rather somber color and a graphic panel that shows the destruction of an EU-funded museum in Yemen, a huge looted site in northern Afghanistan, and recent looting in Iraq, to make that point that cultural heritage is fragile and that in conflict zones it can be easily destroyed and lost. And therefore what we're doing is we're not celebrating it, glorifying it. What we're doing is showing how we're trying to work to create a solution to a problem from a museum perspective, but working with other partners. So that is the sort of very complicated way in which we are differentiating it from our own collections.
Thank you. Let's move to our last guest today. Michele Stefano, you're an expert at the Carabinieri Comando della Tutela dei Beni Culturali in Italy, one of the most important and specialized forces on the protection of cultural heritage in the world. And you've been established, or at least the Carabinieri have been established many, many years ago. Indeed, we're talking about museums. The Carabinieri have created their own museum, Arte Salvata, no? In Rome. Huh? Anyway, so could you tell us more about the action that you are doing as a police force, and also the data of the database that you've established for cultural objects? And perhaps you'd like to respond to some of the interventions we just heard.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Italy has a long history of dealing with looted cultural artifacts, and for 55 years now, 55 years ago, the Carabinieri set up this special unit. The Carabinieri are a military police force, and we have a department that is exclusively dedicated to protecting cultural heritage. The Carabinieri are deployed all across the Italian territory. They started in 1969 with 20 people, and now we are over 300 working in a heritage. So across the Italian territory. In Rome, we also have an operational department that conducts investigations, both nationally and internationally, with other police units. Because protecting national heritage is not just a problem for Italy, and we have had collaborations with many other countries for years now. So the department in Rome is subdivided into 3 sections that also correspond to the 3 issues that our commando works with. So archaeology, antiquities, and forgery and contemporary art. And amongst our tasks, there is a prevention. We do believe a lot in preventive actions, but there's also law enforcement against crime against cultural property, such as the illicit trafficking in archaeological artifacts, the illicit export and forgery of works of art, trading in rare books, and theft. All of in cases of theft, we also conduct investigations. We work in very close contact with the Ministry of Culture. We are indeed a specialized unit, but we are first and foremost a police force. So for scientific input, we work with the civil servants in the Ministry of Culture for their scientific input, especially as regards cultural property and cultural diplomacy. It's not always possible to recover objects via the court system because legal proceedings take a long time, because some objects are not traceable. We have no provenance information. And as an officer that has conducted investigations, I really appreciated the importance given to 2 topics, provenance, and I would add to that inventories, because you can't protect what you're not aware of. And so you need to know objects and giving them a history and a traceability can help you protect them for the years to come. Our department, since the 80s, has been working with a very important instrument, and that is the Stolen Artworks Database. The database of stolen cultural property. It is the broadest and deepest database for this topic, and any objects that are the object of crime are included in this. So over 217,000 events and over 7 million described objects, of which over 1 million still require additional information. These are artifacts that are part of Italian heritage, but also coming from abroad. And we want to include as much information in this database to have a memory of their disappearance. Very often, stolen cultural artifacts are then offered up for sale 20 to 30 years after their theft or looting. And that's something that we observe on a daily basis in our work. Over the years, crimes that threaten cultural heritage have really changed in nature. For example, online sales that are developing and expanding. Therefore, methods used to counter these threats have had to evolve as well. For that reason, we put together a project called SWAT, Stolen Works of Art Systems, a detection system, SWADs, and this is based on artificial intelligence. AI helps us to detect information traded over social media and across the entire web, but also in the deep web or dark web. Data is collected and then compared with the information in our own database. For example, let's take an online sales platform. The system may find an artifact, and the very next morning it gives us a hit or a result. Our operators then establish a comparison with the information we have in our own database to see whether that is one of the objects that is a wanted object or an object that we are seeking. This is a system that we are trying to broaden and deepen to detect even more things on the web. Over the past few years, we've seen that the web, the dark web in particular, has become a prime channel for trade in looted objects. Now, a few minutes ago, you introduced me and mentioned the Museum of Arte Salvata, the Saved Art Museum. And raising awareness of the public is something we really believe in. The Museo dell'Arte Salvata is a museum in Rome, located in former buildings of the Museum of Culture in the Diocletian Baths building, so a Roman building in itself. And here we display cultural heritage artifacts that come back to Italy after being outside of the country for decades. So these recovered objects are displayed for a limited time as a way of showing them to the public and telling the public, look at these cultural artifacts that have come back to Italy and that in a very short while will go back to the cities and the towns that they were stolen from. And this is a highly appreciated activity. And I think it's very important to talk to the community, talk to the public, to make them aware of looting of cultural property. Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, it is a very interesting museum. I visited it myself, and the Carabinieri have really taken very laudable action. And this is a kind of a different perspective than that raised by Mr. St. John Simpson. Here, what you're showing is the result of law enforcement efforts and the positive outcome of efforts aimed at getting back stolen or looted objects. So the perspective is a little different, but I find it very interesting, and that educational role is there. It plays out differently than what other museums do to show what the risks of looting are, or the threat of looting. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Switch, come back to, yeah, we still have a little while, to you, Abdulatif Al-Jasmi. The Museum of Islamic Arts in Qatar has a rich collection of objects from Afghanistan, right? Do the Qatar Museum follow a specific strategy for the acquisition of these objects? Do you have a policy for reviewing the acquisitions and researching doubtful provenances? And perhaps will the new law help you in that respect?
I mean, the short answer is absolutely yes, but there's a reason why, as I guess strategically. You see, Qatar Museums is an umbrella organization, so we have a series of museums, not just a museum. They're thematic in nature, they're not specific to a genre. And we plan our museums a quarter of a century at a time, so we still have several other museums to roll out. In addition to the museum sector, we oversee heritage sites, world heritage, the creative sector, public arts. So there is a lot to kind of keep an eye on to kind of manage our offer. So in a way that has changed the way we do provenance checks. It changed the way that we do monitoring from being sort of specific to what we're looking to acquire to being basically continuous monitoring of everything in the ecosystem. So let's say, for example, Museum of Islamic Art as an example, because you are in the, let's say, in the business of displaying Islamic art, you're monitoring everything that is moving anywhere in relation to Islamic art, instead of just monitoring what you're buying or what you're interested in buying. Number two, because you're planning that far ahead, up to a quarter of a century in some cases, in many cases, we're monitoring up to 10 years in advance for an object to be acquired. So that system basically means that you're monitoring everything instead of just monitoring what you buy. And as I mentioned earlier, you make sure that you're not just following legality, but you're not relying on the, let's say, classic sense of smuggled, forged documents. You're going beyond the legality of it, and you're trying to ensure that that the policy also covered ethical practice, that that has the interest of the object at heart, that has the interest of the conflict area at heart. In some cases, we specifically get asked by the originating state to maintain, to keep the object and maintain it, and we do consider these situations as well. And as a matter of fact, the new law did reflect on all of these considerations, and it's in the executive order specifically laid out on how to approach and how that decision is to be made. And this is not specific to an orphaned object or specific to something that is acquired. I'll give you a real example that I came across. I was a part of an examination for not a collection, but actually 2 objects being shipped normally. They were not being smuggled. They were out in the open from a Gulf state through Qatar over to Lebanon. And it just so happens to be that the inspector on site was Egyptian. The paperwork was complete. There was a court order in place that has confirmed ownership. It was an inherited object by a private owner. And the only problem was any beginner archaeologist would have confirmed that these are Egyptian objects. So they either had to be illicit or they had to be replicas. Because it was moving legally, the only thing that we could have done was actually communicate to the Egyptian side. And lucky for us, both the Lebanese and the Egyptian side agreed, and the objects were returned to Egypt. But we're not so lucky every single time to be able to identify origins or regions or owners. But as long as we continue to monitor everything that is moving in our environment and anything that is moving in the ecosystem of the themes that we manage, I think we will continue to do well in terms of reducing the impact of illicit trafficking.
Thank you very, very much. Sophie, as a lead advisor on legal and risks in this field, what features or qualities would you recommend for a sound antiquities trade business?
Well, I think Rim summarised it very well, actually, because I think she has shown the high legal, ethical, and specialist skills that you need in this field. So, first of all, you really do need to know your subject in terms of the background. These are very, particularly Islamic art, they are very complex works of art. They come often from countries which no longer exist in their current form, so boundaries have changed. For the countries, you need to truly understand that aspect. But this is now, to be a reputable antiquities dealer, you do really need to understand the legal environment in which you're operating, including, again, as Rim mentioned, the anti-money laundering regulations and the ethical piece. And then you really do need to understand the network of buyers and sellers. I think it was a very good comment that Rim made, that actually you do need to know who are the buyers and sellers in this market. Because certainly, as Rim said, it is a red flag when somebody that you really have never met before comes up with an item which just, again, a valuable item which doesn't really make sense. And then you have to have the patience to do the due diligence, which takes time. Again, our teams at Christie's, in the same way as Rim mentioned, they spent a lot of time doing a lot of due diligence, trying to piece together. They are detectives to some extent, going back decades of documents, exhibition notes, whatever it might be, to try to understand where these objects came from and whether it is legitimate to sell them. So it's not dissimilar from what museums are doing. So it is a very complex field, and it takes time, and you really you do, again, as we mentioned beforehand, the more that we can digitalize databases, the more that we can have access to records, the better to enable everyone to operate legally and ethically in this area.
You're absolutely right that it's a huge and complex job that provenance researchers have to do, and it's also very interesting to see that it is becoming a new profession. Provenance researchers are trained in different universities now. They have an art history background or archaeology background and law and archives, and they are very precious people, and not only for the auction houses or any dealers, but also for the museums. It's really a new job, and we need those people more and more to be by our sides.
Yep, no, I'd agree. Totally agree.
Now, Monsieur Angel, est-ce que pensez-vous de la coopération entre les musées et les...
What do you think of cooperation between museums and auction houses or dealers? do you think that this cooperation can work? What could we do to make it work better? Well, yes, I would say that it works quite well. You know, these are lines of work that interact constantly, regularly. There are friendships that are forged in these contexts. I remember back in 2000, in fact, a curator from the Louvre who told me that when she had started out some 40, 50 years earlier, it was strictly forbidden for curators to spend time with art traders or gallery owners. Of course, things have completely changed now. Museums regularly welcome events organized by art dealerships. The Musée Guimet is among them, with the Asian Spring, you know, Sotheby's and Christie's among them. So there is a dialogue there which happens and which I feel can be contributed to by virtue of what we have learned about the objects. Perhaps in the context of exhibitions, we can contribute to this research into provenance and perhaps suggest an avenue to be explored. The Musée Guimet, it must be said, doesn't have an online inventory. We're hoping to resolve this by the end of the year, and that will help to enrich all the different cross-referencing and comparison kinds of work that you can do to refine your understanding of provenance.
Merci. Est-ce que,
Thank you very much. So perhaps, Ms. Bachani, I could ask if you, having worked in Islamic arts for a number of years, have seen changes over time when it comes to due diligence. I mean, you did talk about this earlier, but could you tell us a little more if people become more, even more prudent? Certainly, I think it's quite a tangible change. People have a much more acute sense nowadays than they used to of the fact that some objects are particularly sensitive by their very nature. If we look at architectural elements, for example, when it comes to Islamic arts at least, and certainly manuscripts, folios from Kufic Qurans, for example. So many have come onto the market over time that nowadays people have a lot of questions about the provenance of such folios. When they started to arrive back in the 2000s, that was the case already. And when it comes to conflict zones, which are often the country of origin of such properties, all the players on the market, or at least you would expect this, are fully aware of the need, more than ever, to pay close attention to provenance and to making sure that this is a clean file, if I can put it that way. So, to return to an example that was mentioned during the first panel, I believe, this was a Ghaznavid engraved marble element from Masoud's palace, I believe, which was exported and was given a cultural property certificate at the time. Nowadays, such a development would be unthinkable. I mean, I myself had the case of an orphaned object for which I deemed the provenance to be sound. There was some supporting evidence, but no actual publication. However, I was not able to secure the cultural property certificates precisely because I didn't have more documentation than that. So things have also moved along on the administrative side of things. It is no longer possible to get authorization for export of such cultural properties, and museums have evolved along with this too. As Mr. Engel was saying, the relationship between curators and the art market is much more collaborative than it used to be. There's much more synergy. Nowadays, we can ask questions if we have doubts about the provenance of certain items to tap into their knowledge of art collections in France. And this is a back and forth process, a kind of dialogue. Before a sale, I often invite curators from a given specialty, and they come just to visit, even if they're not interested in the acquisition as such, just to become familiar with what is part of the sale. And if they do want to signal a red flag, they do so. So there has been some change in this respect. So that's to stress the positive side of things. And perhaps, if I may, suggest some avenues for improvement. Of course, many have already been suggested, but returning to what Ms. Carter from Christie's and what Stefano was emphasizing also, inventories, and particularly digitized inventories, or at least access to such inventories for the players on the art markets, is essential. Because if we have this information upstream, then we can avoid the pitfalls, and it can save everyone huge amounts of work, as well as protecting these objects, and potentially providing for restitution or from removing them from the market at an early stage. Access to inventories with digital images is essential for the art market. I have a lot of hope for this database project by ICOM. And then you have AI, artificial intelligence as well, to more easily detect objects in circulation on various platforms, which are not known platforms, known for selling artworks. There are general commercial e-commerce platforms which sell objects from these countries nowadays, and through keyword searches and various other kinds of criteria to identify such objects that are circulating on the network, we'll be able to provide the properties with better protection and protect ourselves better as well, because there are a lot of objects which are initially purchased on these platforms and then reach the market. Thank you very much. You mentioned social networks as some of these new databases or sites. So, Ms. Stefano, perhaps I could return to you. You were talking about your research on the dark web. If we look at things in a more general way, how does your own cooperation as the Italian police and the Carabinieri then work with the art markets? Are they wary of you? No, not at all. We have excellent cooperation. We always have had. And there are a number of different kinds of contexts where we meet. We organize such meetings regularly. The Carabinieri, it should be said, are in charge of making sure that sales are carried out in accordance with the law. But this is a collaborative activity, collaboration with art dealers. There is an established level of trust now, which enables them to come forward, to come to us when they have doubt about the provenance or about the documentation that go along with a particular property. In many cases, the documents are not authentic, so if they have any doubt, they can make contact with us and ask us to check. If they are themselves contacted by dishonest persons offering to sell property with dubious provenance, illicit provenance, similarly, we have good connections with auction houses, and it often happens that auction houses send us their catalog before it is made available to the public, so that we can check that all the properties which are going to be offered for sale are in line with regulations. And that is something we can do all the more easily now that we have these databases to support such checks. In some cases, thanks to this collaboration, we have been able to recover cultural properties that had been stolen, but that came along with forged documents. So yes, I could say that there is excellent collaboration there. Thank you.
documents, fake documentation are a new form. I mean, it's not that new, but we see them more and more. Stories are made up, and nice stories with completely fake documentation, with fake histories, fake persons. So that is something that is one of the difficulties that we see today. I don't know if, and then perhaps we will terminate with that. As ICOM, is ICOM dealing with this aspect in its code or revision of the code? Do you think that perhaps more should be said about establishing the validity of the documentation?
Yes, in the context of the upcoming revision, perhaps that the revision of the Code of Ethics will address more issues around digitalization. So unavoidably, they will, to a certain point, they will have to deal with fake digitalized documentation, things that actually created by the digital and new technologies. So actually it will be a normal fight, because we will use perhaps artificial intelligence for making progress in terms of provenance research that will solve many, many issues. But on the other hand, we have people that actually will take advantage of, again, with the new technologies and create new fake documentation and fake provenance and forgery items even. So, and the battle goes on in this regard.
Thank you very much. Right, I think I'm going to close this panel. Before doing that, is there anyone who would, who has something pressing to say that they would be frustrated not to have said? Would someone like to still say something, or are we happy for the time being? Well, if there's, yes, maybe. Yes, St. John Simpson?
Maybe. Given that we're
I would hate you to leave frustrated.
No, it's been wonderful. No, since that we are here in UNESCO and in Paris, and we have our Afghan colleagues here and friends, we talked, some of us, about the possibility of revising the UNESCO publication some years ago of the highlights of the National Museum of Afghanistan, which at the time of publication then were largely, the whereabouts of them was unknown. But some of those pieces have returned and are safe, we think, in Kabul. But others are still out there. And it's sometimes a little frustrating, I know, for some of our law enforcement colleagues, because they pick up or are advised to look at this catalogue and they don't really know what the status of the objects is. And so I wonder if it's worth starting or resuming discussions amongst us about the advisability of reissuing that catalogue with new photographs, better photographs, and saying which ones are still in the possession of the National Museum of Afghanistan and which ones are still unlocated, because that might focus work on locating the second category.
Or maybe also which ones are located but elsewhere. You know,
I'm using unlocated advisedly. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think UNESCO does a lot in this field, and not only today by getting us all together, and I think they should be commended for that, to bring not only the museum world, but also the art market world here into this intergovernmental agency, which is UNESCO. So I think they should really be commended for doing this. It is also doing a lot in terms of divulging information or disseminating information, such as the national law database, NAT laws, and of course I hope that we will be able to add very soon the new Qatari legislation to that. So that is a very useful tool. It's out there, and it's anyone can consult it. It is working on revising the code of ethics for dealers. And many other issues. So I think, as a conclusion, we could say we have seen a lot of problems. Some are beginning to be solved, but I would like to say once again that UNESCO is a very good place to do this. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to those of the first panel and to all the members of this second panel. Thank you, UNESCO, for hosting us. And I believe that the floor should be given to Mrs. Picat to conclude.
Thank you so much on behalf of UNESCO to all the panelists and the moderators and the participants. I think that we have had a very rich afternoon of exchanges and wonderful ideas emerging, starting from, of course, the acknowledgement that the rich and diverse heritage of Afghanistan is very much at risk and fragile, and our joint efforts are needed to make sure that it's preserved to the extent possible. What we heard during the discussions of at the second panel, I think is very encouraging, because there are definitely, first of all, the good examples that were shared by leading players as far as museums are concerned, art market dealers are concerned. Of course, there are challenges related to due diligence, and there are many pending questions, especially how to deal with artifacts coming from countries in situations of emergencies. But I think that there's also an acknowledgement that progress has been made, that there are tools available like ICOM Red List, like the SWORDS program of Carabinieri, the national examples from Qatar. So this is all good progress, and I think it's good also to acknowledge that there is an increasing awareness also at the international level that we need to work together. So as we said at the opening, of course UNESCO stands ready to continue the work to bring you together, to keep these issues at the international agenda, to try to do what we can by doing advocacy at the international level, by offering also tools like the NAT law database, the virtual museum that is coming up, the code of ethics, of course, but also serving as a platform for these exchanges. So I would say stay tuned. We very much look forward to continuing these discussions in the course of the year, but also in the years to come. And thank you so much for these recommendations and your feedback, because this is very informative for UNESCO as we continue our fight against illicit trafficking. Thank you so much.